Joining us now on the line from Vancouver, British Columbia, Yuen Pau Woo. He is President and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. And Pau, it's good to have you back on the program again. How are you tonight?
Very well. Good to be on the show, Steve.
Glad to have you back. One of the newer economic trends that we want to talk about vis-a-vis China is the wage gap between those who live in the cities and those who toil in the countrysides. And it is now apparently that gap wider than at any time since the economic reforms were first brought in, I guess, just a little over 30 years ago. Tell us how you believe that is affecting Chinese society, that wage gap.
Well, the gap's been in place for a long time. There's always been a huge disparity between the urban and the rural areas. The difference, of course, is that the disparity was one mired in poverty 50 years ago, and now it's a difference between rich, maybe even very rich, and poor or very poor. Disparity is not a good thing for social stability, particularly when social stability is the key driver and priority for the government, the Communist Party. It is the source of legitimacy for the government. And so it's an issue that the authorities will very much want to try to address. On the other hand, though, the disparity is also, not surprisingly, the motivation for workers in the rural areas to migrate to the cities in search for a better life. And that, of course, is the source of the so-called economic miracle in China, where the coastal areas are able to draw on a huge pool of very, very low-cost labor.
When one visits China, what are the social inequalities that you believe are most apparent?
Well, there are different levels of inequality. There's, as you pointed out, the urban-rural gap, which translates principally into this migration from the countryside to the cities. But we should also bear in mind that there's an inequality within the cities as well, and that's becoming more alarming, partly because of the news that we've seen, of course, of workers seeking better wages. They are not able to afford life in the city, particularly housing. Property prices in China have gone up very, very sharply in a number of cities. It's made it impossible for young people, the working class, to afford a home, and that breeds a lot of resentment.
There was an incident that happened a couple of weeks ago, and I must confess I can't recall the last time I heard something like this happen in China, and it was not a one-off, as we say in English. It was, I don't want to say it's a trend, but let me read you this excerpt anyway from UCLA professor C. Cindy Fan, and then get you to react to it. On March 23rd, 42-year-old Zheng Min Sheng used a 12-inch knife to stab 8 school children to death and injure 5 others. Zheng was a surgeon for 18 years before resigning from his hospital job in June 2009. In the U.S., an average doctor can own a house and live a comfortable life. Zheng, on the other hand, slept in the living room in an apartment he shared with his 80-year-old mother and his brother's family of 3. Although Zheng could support himself, his modest income made him a weak contender in the marriage market. According to neighbors, Zheng had dated many women, but none was willing to marry him because he was not rich and could not afford an apartment for himself. I think there were a few other similar attacks in China in the past couple of months, Pau. Are these attacks, do you think, symptomatic of social problems in China today?
It's a very tragic story, isn't it? And your quote hints at what the author thinks might be some of the factors behind the killing. You know, the fact that he couldn't find a wife, that he wasn't earning a very good wage, couldn't afford a home, had to, I think you said, sleep on the couch of his parents' home. But of course, we don't know, in fact, if these were the causes of his barbaric act. It may well have been a mental illness problem that was at the root of the problem. So we shouldn't try to read too much into the social factors around these killings. There is no question, though, that there has been a spate of highly publicized attacks of these sort. They must be very troubling for Chinese parents, citizens, and the government. And the honest truth is that we don't know exactly what's behind them. One would have to imagine that social stress is part of the problem. And the stress is coming from the breakneck economic growth we've seen that has, as you pointed out, increased disparities and created some degree of social alienation, if you will, in Chinese society.
Well, you mentioned highly publicized, and I wonder if that's part of it. Have these things happened in Chinese society in the past, but we just didn't hear about them because it was a much more closed place than it is today?
Of course it's happened in the past before, and not to denigrate or to put down the sanctity and importance of life, but killing in China and the callous taking of life has been a very sad but important part of recent Chinese history. Or you only have to think about the purges, the failed and maniacal campaigns in the 50s and 60s, not to mention the war of the decades before that. Life is not cheap, don't get me wrong, but the taking of life, the loss of life is a common phenomenon in China, including these kinds of barbaric acts. I think it's actually a function of Chinese rapid development and affluence, if you will, sense of greater value in life, that these incidents, in fact, have gathered as much attention as they have recently.
Let me follow up with what the government either is or is not doing to help people sort of cushion the blow from the rapid change that has been happening. In Western democracies, of course, we have, if you're down on your luck, unemployment insurance or welfare or other programs to help soften the blow. Does China have similar programs in place?
Embryonic at best, and this is of course the great challenge for the Chinese government, not simply because it has to deal with problems of unemployment and social unrest and instability and so on, but precisely because this is an authoritarian government founded on socialist principles. You know, we talk about the socialist market economy and we tend to focus on the market economy, part of that phrase, but it is a socialist government that's running a market economy, and so the people have a legitimate right, I suppose, and desire to seek social protection from a government that promised, I suppose, to look after the people. And so that demand for social justice, ultimately, I think is going to be a huge driver of Chinese social and economic development in the years ahead. Probably not unlike the progressive movement that we saw in the United States at the turn of the last century.
You pointed out at the beginning of our conversation that there are some very rich people in China today and of course some very poor people as well. And I wonder what's your sense of whether the very rich, how much are they prepared to sacrifice to help those who are very poor?
It's probably the same as the affluent in other countries where there's some degree of wanting to protect your assets and your privileges. Philanthropy certainly is not a well-developed practice in China, in part because of the socialist welfare state of the 50s and 60s. But I think that's beginning to change, and we saw the seeds of that change with the recent earthquakes in China, particularly the Sichuan earthquake, where there seemed to be quite a flourishing or incipient, nascent flourishing of private philanthropy. People were out in the streets collecting money, and the Chinese people seemed to give quite generously.
Let me read something that was in last month's Foreign Policy magazine, this by Christina Larson. There's an ongoing debate about the causes of the attacks that we just talked about, and she says, I wanted to weigh in. The root issue here is mental health. Mental illness is still a largely taboo topic in China. It is firstly poorly understood. The remnants of China's vast state-run healthcare system, which is now in the process of overhaul, made few provisions for mental health. Mental health was, in essence, treated as a catch-all category for activities considered socially deviant in China. Until 2001, for instance, homosexuality was included on the government's official list of mental illnesses. Mentally disturbed individuals are still considered an embarrassment to their families, and secrecy is preferred over therapy. This is a terrible and looming problem for a country experiencing such profound changes which strain interpersonal bonds and individual psyches. Pau, what do you think of that analysis?
Strong language, a lot of truth in what the writer says. She is correct that mental health is a taboo in China and in Chinese culture broadly. It tends to be swept under the carpet. There aren't good institutional provisions to either address or to make public or raise awareness or indeed to look after the mentally ill. And so I would not be surprised if mental illness does result in some of these horrific attacks. But of course, it's more than just mental illness. It's really the stage of development that China is in, where it has focused very much on providing material goods for its people, to the neglect of the, you might say, the softer side or the social side of things, including mental illness, including unemployment protection, social welfare, healthcare, care for the disabled. I mean, that's another good example of an area where the disabled in China were shunned, they were not looked after. That's changed a lot in recent years, and I think similarly with mental health, I expect that more attention will be given to this very key aspect of social challenge in China.
Do you think there's an understanding among the Chinese leadership that this is a new day and they have to regard these issues, say, differently from the way they did 10 years ago?
I think the Chinese leadership is ahead of most Western commentators on this issue. The single most important priority for the Communist Party is survival. They are an authoritarian, Leninist, one-party state that has been very successful in producing the goods, the material welfare, but they know that their legitimacy is founded not only on the production of material welfare, but on providing sort of social stability. And they clearly will see that workers unhappy with wages, civil servants who are badly treated, citizens who live in polluted areas, mentally ill who are going out and killing their fellow citizens. All of these issues threaten social stability and they threaten the survival of the party.
Okay, let me follow up on that, because certainly there are people who believe, as you do, that all of these things chip away at the authority of the Communist Party in running China. But I can find other commentators who say this is a very well-entrenched organization and they're not going anywhere for a very long time. Where do you come down on that dichotomy?
I agree. I don't see any near-term threat to the party. We have to look at the big picture of China's overall progress and its place in the world, and what we know from the few polls that are done suggests that Chinese citizens by and large are very happy with the direction of their country. The Pew Global Survey that asks citizens about how they feel their country's direction is going suggests that China is the most satisfied. Chinese citizens are the most satisfied at about 90%. In Canada, it's 51%. In the US, it's well under 50%. So looking at it in big picture terms, there is still quite a deep well of support for the fundamentals of what the government is providing for the Chinese people.
I wonder how much longer that will last, though, because you know, that number is very high because expectations may be here, but expectations in China have got to be rising among the average Chinese citizen. Isn't that the case?
Absolutely, and the satisfaction is a function of the belief in a better life, a belief in progress, if you will. You know, it's a concept that many Westerners don't believe in anymore. But the Chinese and many others in emerging markets and developing countries believe in progress, and they hang on to that as a source of their willingness to toil long hours in a factory doing repetitive work. So the Chinese government has to keep providing that material progress, and it has to provide the sort of social stability and structure that can support the many who inevitably will fall through the cracks.
In our last 30 seconds, Pa, can you tell me, what do you think the Chinese sense of identity is these days?
Confidence, a sense of coming of age, some apprehension about domestic concerns, livelihood issues, and so you'll have this continued dichotomy. On the one hand, a sort of confidence and maturity in the world, taking China's place on the world stage and feeling proud of it, and yet being worried and agitating, if you will, for more social improvement domestically.
Paul, it's always good of you to join us here on TVO. Thanks so much for joining us again tonight.
It's a pleasure.